and share with you who Maryland Mentor is and who our presenters are today. And yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. They've got a lot of great things to talk about, and I'm really excited for this. So today's topic is how to have conversations about race with your BIPOC mentors. So your Black, Indigenous people of color. Let me go to slide 2 here. It'll go. There we go. Okay, so this is our welcome circle. You know, traditionally we are in a face-to-face setting, and so we like to do these welcome circles, you know, give everybody the chance to introduce themselves and just recognize everybody's space and their presence, and yeah, and just kind of create the mood for the rest of the training. And so I guess in a virtual setting, we're kind of doing that in the chat box, you know, keeping the energy up, sharing with one another as well. But we like to say this a lot. We ask that you just give everyone space and grace, you know, give us some space and grace, as well as all the other attendees that are here with us today. You know, this is a very stressful times, as I'm sure we all talk about very frequently, but yes, space and grace right now. All right, so here's our team, and some of us today will be actually facilitating the training. Me, Dakota Shamblin, I'm the Program Outreach Vista here at Maryland Mentor, and also our Executive Director, Sadiq, will also be speaking today in this webinar. And here's some of our other amazing team members. We have our other 2 Vistas, Olivia James and Antoine. And then we have our new Program Support Manager, Carlos, and our Operations Manager, Sada. So who is Maryland Mentor? So we are one of about 26 statewide affiliates of the Mentor, the National Mentoring Partnership. And so we started in about January of 2018, and our shared mission with our other affiliates is to fuel the quality and quantity of mentoring relationships across the state, as well as to close that mentoring gap, which research has shown us is that 1 out of 3 young people do not have a supportive adult in their life. And so, you know, how do we go about fulfilling this mission? We support the mentoring programs and organizations that support the young people directly. So what does this support look like? Here's just a quick list of some of the really cool resources and services we provide. If you head over to mentoring.org, that's our national partnership website. There's a whole resource library with a number of trainings, guides, webinars that could be of assistance to your program. Our big service is our free program consulting and technical assistance, which goes through the NMRC, the National Mentoring Resource Center. Highly recommend. Again, it's free, and this is really tailored to your program, you know, establishing where you're at and where you can go. And then we have our mentoring connector, as well as a few others, the NQMS, you know, trainings, roundtables, things of that sort. But definitely check out the Maryland Mentor website for more information about these things. I can get it. Okay, and then these are just some additional tools. Our EEP, Elements of Effective Practice for Mentoring, is really what we use for all of our training services. We come back to this every time and use the benchmarks and standards that are discussed in this booklet. So I definitely recommend checking that out. And then here are just some webinar logistics we like to go over as we go through this webinar. Again, this is a webinar, so you will remain muted and off video unless called upon by the speaker. And so, you know, utilize that chat box, put some comments, questions, aha moments. And again, just a reminder, make sure you click that drop-down menu and put panelists and attendees so, you know, everybody can see your comments. And also, if you have a question or a comment to make and you want to do it verbally, raise your hand and we can actually unmute you and you can share. And then towards the end of the presentation, there is an evaluation, and we would be very appreciative if you took a few minutes and completed that evaluation. It's really helpful for us as well as our trainers today. And then at the end, you know, obviously put some questions and comments in the chat box, but, you know, we will give you guys some space and time to share. And again, please give each other space and grace and have fun. So I'm going to introduce our trainers today. We have Garrison Martinez and Jasmine Paxson, and these are actually a part of one of our program partners, Talbot Mentors, located in Talbot County. And their executive director, Garrison Martinez, will be facilitating along with their program manager, Jasmine Paxson. And I'm very excited for you guys to hear from them. They have a lot of great things to talk about today. So I'll go ahead and pass it on to Sadiq.
Actually, I'm gonna pass it right back. Hot potato. I'm gonna pass it right back to Harrison and Jasmine.
Sure. All right. Thank you, Sadiq. And thank you, Maryland Mentor, for giving us this opportunity to participate in this webinar, and this really, really important beginning of a conversation. So just by way of introduction, again, my name is Gerson Martinez. I'm the executive director of Talbot Mentors. We are a mentoring organization that's about 24 years old here in Talbot County, Maryland. We're on the Eastern Shore. We're on your way to the beach. If you make your way out to Ocean City, you definitely have to go through Easton. So we're out here in rural Maryland. But I think as a small independent rural mentoring organization, you know, we've had the benefit of a really diverse, I think, body of stakeholders in our organization, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But anyway, I have the privilege of serving as the executive director of the organization. I've been with the organization for 3 years. Prior to being with Talbot Mentors, I was also fortunate enough to be in the education space in New York City. And prior to that, I was in the capital markets space in New York City as well. So that's just a little bit about me. I'll have plenty of time to talk a little bit later. So I'll hand it over to my colleague, Jasmine.
My name is Jasmine Paxson. I'm the program manager at Talbot Mentors. I'm actually a former mentee in the program. So I've been with Talbot Mentors since I was about 9 years old. And a current mentor. And then also, since this conversation is about race today, I'd like to isolate race and say that I'm a Black woman to a white mother. Excellent. So we want to just go ahead and jump into our agenda that will pretty much outline our conversation for today. So first, we're going to start with the context for our conversation. So why are we even having this conversation? Then we're going to define some norms for having the conversation, go into our key terms to understand really the substance of the conversation, or the 4 characteristics necessary for difficult conversations. And then if you guys have any questions, observations, and takeaways, and then that training evaluation that Dakota mentioned as well.
Yes, excellent. And before we dive into the meat of the conversation, we thought it would be important to spend a few minutes talking about the context around the topic today, which is how to begin to have a conversation about race with a BIPOC mentee. So for this, I'd like to hand it over to Sadiq to kind of kick us off with a little bit of context for this conversation.
Yeah, no, awesome. Really appreciate everybody. Good afternoon to everyone out there. Really appreciate you all's presence. So thankful and appreciative to the Talbot Mentors team for the time that you all not only put in preparation for this presentation and conversation today, but again, just all the work that you all do in terms of leading with passion and heart, et cetera, which is again the perfect segue as we talk about context. So here at Maryland Mentor, we are, wrestling very deeply, as is the rest of the mentoring field in terms of context, with the implications of race, just like, again, the rest of us are, on all of the implications on our lives. What does it mean to be a person of color? What does it mean to be a white person in America, alive in 2020, under the shadow of white supremacy and systemic racism, and all of the different forms and facets that takes? The mentoring field, without question, is not immune to those conversations. And if anything, the magnifying glass, and the impact potentially is exacerbated because mentoring obviously deals with our most vulnerable population. That is our young people. So in the context of that, we have been really in a soul-searching phase as Maryland Mentor in terms of making sure that we are centering racial justice and equity and inclusion as part of all of our conversations, not as, you know, a happenstance appendage, but baking that into everything that we do. So it's no longer accidental or a part of something that we do, but again, it's rather in the DNA of what we do. So this conversation is very, very fitting and was planned to really come immediately after, for those of you all who joined us or had the opportunity to join us just a couple of weeks ago when we had really the first of several conversations that we'll be having over the next couple of months. But that conversation 2 weeks ago was around combating white saviorism and mentoring, which is really, you know, from an adult standpoint. Now with this conversation, we bring back the idea of bringing back into the conversation our young people, and how do we recenter them as the hero and as the centerpiece of the mentoring relationship, not the program, not the mentor, very, very critical, but we have to ensure that we are centering young people. So with that, the last piece that I really wanted to make sure that I highlighted as part of this intro before I pass it back to the awesome Talbot team is that also central to the Maryland Mentor philosophy is centering programs in the exact same way that we've just asked you all and continue to, you know, to challenge each other to center young people. It's our job to highlight, uplift, and center mentoring programs from across the state that are doing amazing work. We are not the keepers of every bit of knowledge as it pertains to mentoring. Sometimes, again, we're cheerleaders, amplifiers from the work that is happening directly in the field. And there's no better example of that than the work that Talbot Mentors is doing. They did this presentation in a similar format a couple of different times for their program in particular in their local community in Talbot County. And we said, Harrison, Jasmine, Allen, board, Talbot Mentors board, this is too critical of a conversation to just keep it in Talbot County. We need to lift this up and have a greater conversation with the entire mentoring field here in Maryland, or as, you know, as many of us can make it this evening. So a little bit of context. Again, I'm so appreciative of the Talbot team. And one other point that I'm sure will be echoed throughout this conversation is that we don't expect to solve white supremacy and systemic racism today. This is the beginning. Right? This is the beginning. And we really, really encourage folks to not walk out of this conversation if you don't get this entire list of tips and strategies and et cetera, you know, to feel deflated, but rather let that serve as an opening point for us to continue these conversations individually and inside our own organization. So with that, I'll pass it back to you all. Really appreciate it.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Sadiq, for kind of giving us a little bit of context from the Maryland Mentor perspective. And for everyone on the line, just to clarify the relationship between Maryland Mentor and our program, Talbot Mentors. Maryland Mentor is the state affiliate of the National Mentoring Partnership. So this is the industry group for us, right? So we as an organization look to Maryland Mentor for leadership on all matters that social matters and professional matters that make us a better organization. So I'm really grateful to the Maryland Mentor team for leaning into this topic of racial equity and racial justice because it has allowed us the freedom, the opportunity to flesh out those same topics at a local level. So I want to just talk to you for just a couple of minutes about the context that has led us as an organization locally in Talbot County, to this conversation. And I think to echo some of what Sadiq mentioned, it cannot be ignored that our entire nation is reckoning with racial justice and racial equity. I would say that in 2020 specifically, George Floyd's death this spring was really served as a catalyst, I think, across the nation, but of course also in our community, for every organization, every sector in our community to begin to be introspective, a little bit and say, what role do we play in this conversation? first of all, do we play any role? And number two, if we do play a role in this matter, if we are not a neutral agent, but can actually impact and influence change in a positive direction, then we have to own that leadership role. So Talbot Mentors has taken on a position to kind of lean into this topic, right? Not to shy away from it, but rather to lean in, have try to figure out the ways to be a positive influence, positive change agent when it comes to understanding racial inequity, understanding racial injustice, and then seeing how we as an organization and more broadly as a sector can actually start to impact the systemic barriers that that plague and hold our children back from everything that they are capable of achieving. And the last thing I would say before we move on to a quick poll that we want to conduct is that the other thing I want everyone to kind of carry with you as we have this conversation today is that we are not just talking about individual behaviors here. This topic of racial equity and racial justice within the mentoring space is not simply about individual, relationships, but also about our system as a whole, our mentoring, our system of mentorship in this country, in this state, and in our local community. So keep that in mind. These are principles, these are things that we want to hopefully help to influence on a broader scale than just on the individual level. So with that, I'll ask the Maryland Mentor team if we could perhaps introduce the poll that we prepared. Is that something, Dakota, are you able to launch that for us? Excellent. So for everyone on the line, if you could answer 3 quick questions that are going to be on your screen here, you should be able to see the first one. Simply, have you had a conversation on race with a young person of color? Yes or no? We just kind of want to pulse check here where we all are. And Dakota, I'll leave it to you to prompt the second one, just because I'm not able to see the results there. Perfect. Question number 2, very simply, are you a person who identifies as a person of color? Yes or no? Excellent. And then question number 3, how do you think that conversation went? For those of you who answered yes to the first question, how do you think that conversation went on a scale of 1 to 10? 10 being it went perfectly. It was positive and encouraging. On a scale of 1 to 10, how did that conversation go? And as we close out that third question, as everyone answers that third question, I want to transition then over to the next portion of our time here, which is to clarify some norms that we want to make sure to adhere to as we continue our conversation today. So Dakota, if you wouldn't mind switching over to the next slide for us. Excellent. So Jazz, I'll hand it over to you for the first norms.
Yes. So as Kirsten said, that we will use these norms to guide our conversation tonight. So our first norm is that we ask that you stay engaged in this conversation, that you racialize your voice. So when we speak, we need to make sure that we're isolating race. And that means knowing that for myself, I can only speak from my experience as a Black woman. also speak your own truth. When we share out at the end, making sure what you're sharing out is personal to you, local and immediate. Not that you're sharing someone else's story or something that you heard, but it's your own truth.
Excellent. Thank you, Jazz. And then the last two norms that we want to highlight and remind everyone of is to experience discomfort. Now, this might be almost seem a bit counterintuitive, but we are talking about an inherently uncomfortable topic. So we just ask you to be okay with experiencing discomfort with some of what you might hear. That's okay in this conversation about race. So experience discomfort. And lastly, as Sadiq highlighted a little bit earlier, we ask that you expect and accept non-closure. What that means is that tonight we will not resolve all of the issues that we know are, are out there in the world with respect to racial justice and racial equity. But we do ask you to kind of enter this space and enter this conversation, knowing that we are not going to close out, we're not going to reach closure on any of these issues. All we are trying to do today is to give you some guidelines and some guidance on how to begin to approach the conversation about race with your mentee or with a young person who is BIPOC. So, and Sadiq just sent me a note here. We would like to give you all a few minutes to ask, to stop at this juncture and in the chat, or if you'd like to unmute yourselves, share out a little bit for those of you who answered that you have had conversations on race with these with a young person who's BIPOC. If anyone would like to share, we have a good amount of people on the line today, so I hope that some of you are willing to unmute yourselves or share in the chat. Maybe give us a little bit about what went well and what didn't go well, or what you thought might have been missing in a conversation about race that you may have already had.
Awesome, Dakota. It looks like we have a hand up too.
Hey, Sadiq.
Yes.
I'm not able to see on my end just because I have that presentation up.
Let's see here. Let me see if I can unmute. So we got a couple hands up. Now we're cooking now. We're cooking with grease. Hi, Carol. I'm going to unmute you, Carol, now. Carol, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. I'm Carol Feeney from New Mexico. I've worked with the refugee resettlement population, and I tend to, over the years, gravitate to young girls from Africa who have come here as political refugees. And I found that it's very effective because when I mentor them, they mentor their cousins and siblings, and when they grow up, two of them have gone through college, and talking about race to them has been very uncomfortable for me. We've read books about it. That way I'm sort of directing the race discussion to the book, and then we discuss the book. In Albuquerque, New Mexico, I would say that we don't have the kind of racism that you have on the East Coast because the history is different. But it was uncomfortable for me because they got their citizenship as U.S. citizens, and I felt a little bit embarrassed, very embarrassed about our country's history, which they were unaware of, being who they were from Africa. They weren't really taught like we were about the institution of slavery and systemic racism. So they didn't really experience it, except I would say once they were thrown off the school bus because they were accused falsely. And this was a second grader and a kindergartner, and it was just horrifying to me. And they didn't tell me about it until later when they started talking about racism that they had experienced. So they thankfully have not experienced a lot of racism, and they don't see it as systemic, but it was very awkward for me as a white person to have to approach this with them, and not wanting to feel personal shame, but actually feeling personal shame. It was something I don't feel equipped to do. Thank you for listening to me.
Awesome.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's so interesting, and it's so actually encouraging, to hear perspectives from across the country, right? Because I think you're right. The lived experiences and the dynamics in different localities are run the gamut, right? They are on a really wide spectrum. So I really appreciate your perspective. Thank you so much. Anyone else want to share a little bit about what it has been like to talk about race with young people of color?
Yes, so we have a Maria Brown. You should be able to talk. You just have to unmute yourself.
Hi, everyone. My issue was with my niece who attends private school, and the school is predominantly Caucasian. It's approximately 10 African-American students. And her problem came in where in the library, there was no books that represented African-American children. So we encouraged her to go and talk to the librarian, and she did. And the librarian did get books that reflect to African-American children, but she gave all the books to my niece instead of putting the books in the library where the other African-American children could reach them, read them as well. So what the problem seemed to be, we had to explain to her how come there were no books that represented who she was in this library. As well as explain to her how come there's only approximately 10 African-American students and she's not getting to see those. And while they put all the African-American children in one group, and if they're in the same class, they group them together instead of letting them be social and mingle. So that was a very tough time for us to explain that to her and to get her, to understand this world's not perfect. It's not perfect. We love all people, and we teach her to, love all people, respect all people, and get along with all.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you for sharing that, Maria. And hopefully a little bit of what we'll talk about later on in the agenda might be helpful to you as you approach that young person about, how to kind of grapple with her, how to reconcile some of the stuff that happens around her. So thank you for sharing that.
All right, I think we have another question from Agnegon. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, but.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my experience was I run a soccer organization down here on the Silver Spring, and then I remember our first year where we ready to start competing, and then we had to join the league on the Germantown. It was dominated by a white organization. So my kid was looking down, very down to like, where they coming from, what's your name? And then my question to prepare them mentally before we get to that competition, and then show what we learn, who we are, what can we do, is to let them know exactly this racial stuff exists, and you got to be ready mentally to make sure you play the game to change the dynamism for how somebody perceives you, how somebody see you, or somebody receive you. So it means down the road right away, they see you are black, minority, most African kid, and then they want to put you down and win you. But the game can change everything. So I'll urge you to go to the field and beat them badly so they can give you respect. So that kind of word I put on in my kids' heads, it changed totally the whole dynamism by the way we spend 4 years on the season. We want everything. What they had to do is just kick off on the league because they let me know right away, say, hey, if you stay too long here, you're going to spoil all the business because white kids, they're going to go home and then cry and they're not going to come and play. So to come here, today on this forum and then listen to what we are talking about, and it's still there around us, it's still in the community, it's still everywhere. But I believe for our Black kids or Black brown kids, this topic of discussion had to be something we do often to prepare them. So, hey, the life is not going to be easy for you because you're different than people. But if you know you can use your differences to make people respect you, do it because it's a power God give it to you. So it is something, Shirley, I just want to share. Say we can empower our kids with a good word, especially those who have a chance to compete and who they know, oh, what's your name? Or your name sounds differently. Oh, your name is Mamadou. Your name is Nyanya. Oh, but do not let anybody put you down by your name or by your color or by your race, by where you're coming from. But is there anything had to be between you and that guy or that person to be competing? Use your power God give it to you to beat him to rest.
I just want to share with you guys. Call.
Sorry, I think we may have lost the audio there on our participant. But I want to thank you so much. I think you got a lot of I think we captured a lot of what you were saying, sir. And so thank you for first of all for reiterating the importance of having these discussing these topics often, right? This is a very relevant topic in our space as a mentoring industry, as a mentoring sector, of our economy as well. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. I do want to highlight one quick question, one question that I see from Teddy Beschel in the chat, and it's about one of our rules. Teddy says, I have a question about the third bullet point. Is that a hard and fast rule? I understand focusing on our own experiences and stories, but is it ever helpful to echo personal stories that others have shared with you? Thank you for that question, Teddy. And I'll just give you my quick sense on or why we put this norm out there in any conversations about race. And the reason is because we don't want to speak on behalf of other folks whose experiences we have not actually had, right? So anytime that I speak, for example, on behalf of Jasmine, I may be making assumptions about what she thinks, what she feels, how she interpreted something that happened to her. So it is a rule that we want to reiterate that what we speak about here, come from your personal experience with a young person that you may have spoken with, or your racialized experience as a person of color or a Caucasian person as well. Jazz, is there anything that you would add to that? I'm sorry, what are your thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think a way kind of to interpret that also in thinking about someone else's story is reflecting on how listening to someone else's story made you feel, because that way it's personal to you. So not that you're necessarily sharing their story, but you're really reflecting on what kind of feelings that brought up for you.
Excellent. Thank you, Jazz. And now in the interest of time, we're going to keep moving on here to our the next subject area here. So we want to make sure that in this conversation and any conversation about race, we clearly define some terms. So there are 4 terms that we want to define here today. You see them here on your screen: humility, racialized experience, and then equality and equity, which are two totally different things. I'll start by describing or just making sure that we're clear on the definitions of the first two. So in the context of this conversation, when we talk about humility, which you'll hear us, allude to this characteristic during this conversation, what we mean is, carrying yourself with humility is making sure that you understand that your experiences and my experiences are limited to our own racial identities. So again, we need, humility is an important characteristic to carry with you as you think critically about these topics of racial conversation. And the second term that we want to clearly define for today is what we mean when we say racialized experience. You may hear us use this term, and what that means is understanding that a young person's lived experience, that this is a young person's lived experience based on their race. So again, going back to our norm of isolating race, we want to make sure that we acknowledge that experiences are racialized, right? And it would be incorrect for us to remove or assume that race didn't have a role to play in a certain experience. So that's what we mean by those first two. Jazz?
And so you can see this graphic on the side of the screen. I'm sure a lot of you probably have been familiar with this or seen different variations, but just wanting to show this to understand the difference between equality versus equity. So equality is giving everybody the exact same thing. So you can see where they all have a box because there's the barrier of the fence to watching the game. And then you see on the next piece, there's equity, which is giving everybody exactly what they need so that they're able to see the game. And there's other variations of this where, there's justice and the fence is knocked down completely because they've removed the barrier. But this is just the base understanding of those two terms.
Excellent. Thank you, Jazz. And just to reiterate, that is very, very important. If there's something that we hope that you take away from today's conversation, the first takeaway would be that difference between equity and equality. We often use the terms interchangeably, but we absolutely want everyone to understand that those are two very different topics. So thank you, Jazz, for explaining them as succinctly as you did. So moving on, Dakota, I'm sorry. There we go. All right. So why are we talking about this today? And I'll speak first to our organization and why it's relevant to us. What you see in front of you here is a quick bar chart that quickly represents or simply represents the racial demographics of our mentees and our mentors. Mentees represented in blue and mentors represented in red. And what that tells us is that about 80% of the mentees in the Talbot Mentors program are young people of color. They're either Black, brown, or Black, Indigenous, or people of color in general. Conversely, about 80% of our mentors are Caucasian, are white. And so what we understand, what we acknowledge is that at Talbot Mentors, we exist with a diversity dynamic. That means that we have a diverse mix of adults who do the volunteer work in our organization and young people that we serve. So you might wonder, is that just your organization or is that a national trend? And Dakota, if you could hit just the space button real quick to animate the slide there. It'll not, there we go. Yes. So nationally, and I know we have folks from across the country here, 65% of mentors in mentoring organizations, about 65% of the volunteers at mentoring organizations are white, and about 60% of the mentees that they serve are people of color. So again, the Talbot Mentors local, hyper-local rural Maryland experience is a microcosm of a national reality. right? Generally speaking, mentoring programs employ volunteers, you know, or utilize volunteers who are predominantly white to serve predominantly Black and brown young people. Dakota, if you could get us to the next slide, please. So what that means then is that everyone on the line here, everyone who has something to do with mentorship, we then have the duty, the responsibility to acknowledge race in the mentoring space. Next slide, please.
Okay. So acknowledging race validates a young person's lived experience, and then not acknowledging race inherently devalues the racialized experience of young people. So an example that we often hear of not acknowledging race would be people being colorblind. So when people say, I don't see color because I treat everyone equally. But then this goes back to those defined terms that we just went to. And we're not seeking equality, we're seeking equity. So that's really an important distinction there.
Yes. And to the question on the screen here, how then can we approach conversations about race with youth? If we've established that the conversation is necessary and important to have, you know, how then do we have conversations about race with youth? So we've laid some groundwork for you, and now we'll spend the rest of our time discussing 3 characteristics that we believe are necessary for every person, every adult who engages with a young person to understand and apply in the context of conversations on race. These 3 characteristics will lead to one action, which we will conclude our time with. So Dakota, next slide. Thank you. The first characteristic that we want to make sure to highlight here is that of openness. So if we're speaking to the adults here, let's say the proverbial adults in the room who engage with young people, we ask you to consider openness as a necessary characteristic. What does openness mean? And we put together a definition, you know, from a variety of places, but what we mean by openness is, or the definition of openness can be thought of as having a barrier, such as a door, so adjusted so as to allow passage. So in this context, what that means, openness refers to your ability, and when I say your, I am speaking to, you know, those of us adults who engage with young people. Openness refers to your ability to open up to your own learning and being willing to engage in a conversation with a young person who may actually teach you something, right? So openness is about being open to your own learning so as to allow passage, you know, of new information and new perspective that a young person may offer to you.
And so there are often, we were saying,
hang on, Dakota, sorry, thank you.
There are often barriers to having conversations on race. An example of a barrier to openness would be the mentor's own comfort. So this goes back to our norms. To experience discomfort, it's easier not to address race than it is to become uncomfortable entering into a conversation. And so then another barrier would be the assumption that the young person just won't understand. So thinking maybe that they're too young to start these conversations. But really, we need to recognize that young people understand a lot more than we give them credit for. If they're able to point things out and ask questions, they're able to start having that conversation then. I know that I've had conversations with my 11-year-old same race mentee, and Harrison's had conversations with his 16-year-old same race mentee.
Yes, exactly. And as Jasmine said, I have the privilege of mentoring a young man who's 16 years old and who is also a Latino like I am. And Jazz is exactly right. You know, young people, we should not assume that they're not ready, you know, to talk about these things, that they don't want to talk about, you know, their own racialized experiences. It's actually been a place where my mentee and I have actually connected really strongly, you know, in talking about such a vulnerable but important topic to him. So yes, you know, when I enter those conversations, when we enter those conversations, I'm not there to teach him something about race. I'm there to listen to him and be open to learning from him. Next slide, please. The second characteristic that we ask that you carry with you and think about as you enter these conversations is the concept of understanding. Again, seems like a pretty simple concept, right? A very familiar one to all of us. What we mean by understanding is that it is an agreement of opinion or feeling. It is also an adjustment of differences. So as an adult, you know, as an adult, I need to come into the conversation with humility, you know, a term that we defined earlier, knowing that I have a different and limited, importantly, a limited perspective on the topic, limited by my own race, right? If I'm talking to a young person who's not of my race, then I have to understand, you know, that I have to make an adjustment to understand him or her, right? On the basis of their racialized experience.
And so when we have, like they were saying, the diversity dynamic of cross-race matches, when the adult realizes that there are things that they haven't lived through themselves, then it's the responsibility of the adult to do the work to really better understand, not for the youth of color to have to justify their racialized experiences. So statements like, you're being too sensitive, or are you sure your teacher was not just saying that because you're misbehaving, not because you're Black? These example statements showed an adult questioning whether a child's experience is about race, but it's not up to you to fix the problems of the young people, but it's for you to listen to them. It might be easy to say that, oh, I'm going to go talk to your teacher, but that only addresses the one incident for one child. And we need to understand that this is a bigger issue. This is a systemic problem.
Yeah, and as Jasmine just alluded to, just to take a quick step back or to revisit something that she just mentioned, you know, I don't know if anyone on the line here has ever engaged as an adult, you know, in a conversation about race where someone may have said, you know what, maybe that wasn't about race. Are you sure that person wasn't just being X, you know, that person wasn't just trying to compliment your hair by touching it, you know, are you sure they weren't just trying to be polite and that wasn't about race? That even happens to us as adults, right? So we just want to bring, you know, to your awareness here, how important it is, you know, to enter into this conversation with a young person with understanding, you know, that devaluing or not, you know, not placing proper value on that young person's experience, or saying, are you sure that was about race, inherently, you know, devalues and does not show a willingness to understand and adjust our perspective. So as adults, that's very, very important. Dakota, if you could take us to the next one. All right. The third characteristic that we ask that you consider is that of vulnerability. Vulnerability in this context is uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. Again, as adults, in the context of mentoring, we often might think that, hey, I'm rock solid. I'm here to, you know, help a young person, support a young person. And we may not often allow ourselves the opportunity to experience risk and emotional exposure, especially when it comes to race, right? When it comes to conversations about race. So it's quite necessary, you know, to show vulnerability to a young person of color when you are even thinking about entering a conversation about race. Many of you may be familiar with Brene Brown. She's an esteemed psychologist and speaker and writer and all the rest of it. And she acknowledges, she says, vulnerability is not a weakness. In fact, it's our most accurate measure of courage. So when we are endeavoring to have a conversation about race with a young person, walking into it with vulnerability, with humility and vulnerability, signal to that young person, okay, they're meeting me with vulnerability. Now, the young person might be willing to meet me there and be vulnerable with me, right? It's really, as Jasmine mentioned earlier, it really is the responsibility of the adult to offer that vulnerability first. Being vulnerable requires you also to be able to call yourself out, right? It requires me to be able to call myself out. Being vulnerable requires emotional risk of opening up. It may be that this young person rejects, my conversation, right? That's emotional risk, but that's, as the adults in mentoring relationships, those are risks that we should be willing to take to show vulnerability. We must be open to the possibility, that even some of our actions in the past with our mentees may have caused harm, even when we meant them for good. Maybe our intent was one, but our impact was another. I'll leave it at that.
And so following up on that last point, so if our intent was one thing and our impact was different, part of this being vulnerable is being able to say to our mentees, I'm sorry if I ever made you feel a certain way in the past, or being vulnerable when your perspective has changed to say, hey, I know I used to think one certain way, but my perspective has changed. And I want you to let me know if I ever say something that makes you feel uncomfortable so that I can learn. That way you're being vulnerable, opening yourself up, and allowing your mentee to know that you're not perfect. And like we said, you're not going to have all of the answers, but that they feel as though they can call you out when something hurts them. Yeah.
Thank you, Jazz. And before we move on to the final kind of tenet here, or the action item that this is all leading up to, I would invite us to go back a little bit and maybe Dakota, I'm sorry, if you could take us back 2 slides, to the first one. And I'd like to open up the microphone here to anyone on the line. If you could maybe share, if anyone's willing to share some specific examples of times where, or examples where you've experienced, openness, what that feels like, having an open and humble conversation, with a young person. Are there anyone who's willing to share a little bit of what that might have felt like before?
We do have one hand raised from Lysandra Bridges. I'm going to unmute you right now.
Excellent, thank you.
How is everybody doing today? I do have a story. My name is Dr. Bridges. I'm a TA for Maryland Mentor, and one of the stories that I have that I want to share is from working with Concerned Black Men National for a few years. Is I would often have conversations with some of the mentees that I work with about police brutality, and during those conversations, what I would do is give these mentees about 10 different things or steps that they could do in the case that they were stopped by a police officer. And what this conversation led to was that what I found out was a lot of our young people, especially inner city, and particularly in Columbia, South Carolina, where I was working, that oftentimes that they already have a certain feeling or understanding of how the law works, and how they see in the news where they see a lot of men of color are being shot down. And so they have a negative idea about the police. And so what I try to do is I try to, number one, because usually the conversation leads to two things. Number one, decision making, and then the value of life. And so I think one of the things that we have to do is when we talk to our young, like you said, number one is be open to how they feel about certain topics that surround situations of something that deals with the law and deals with policing, and as well as I would have to say, instead of teaching our mentees what to think, I think the best thing that we have to do is somehow when we are interacting with them is teaching them how to think. And so if they are ever, because it's one thing to see it and see the visuals, but then it's another thing to actually go through that experience. And so when we're talking with them, like you said, number one is just being open and understanding where they come from, and allow them to speak their truth.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you very much, Mr. Bridges. Appreciate that input. Anyone else have any thoughts on any of the three characteristics that we have highlighted here so far?
And there's an excellent question in the chat box.
I saw that.
Teddy.
I saw that. Sadiq, would you mind reading that for us?
Let's do it. So Teddy just has a question about initiating the vulnerability versus putting mentees in a position to educate the mentor, right? Which is more of that sort of emotional labor that many of our activist friends talk about, right? Like it's not the person of color's job to educate, right? The uninformed, right? But so excellent question, Teddy. And Teddy goes on to say, completely agree with Jasmine's previous point about ignoring issues of race and that we can inflict harm by ignoring that reality, and this affects our BIPOC mentees. Having said that, again, we also don't want to put mentees in a place where they have to teach us. How do we balance the two? What are you all's thoughts on that? And when do you think it's important for mentors to initiate conversations about race? And when do you think it is harmful? So there's like 5 or 6 excellent questions wrapped up in one here. Appreciate that, Teddy.
Yeah, Teddy, you are firing on all cylinders here. You're touching on some stuff that we've talked about, and you're touching on the action item that we have not yet visited. So thank you for being so engaged and for these insightful questions. But maybe if we could isolate just the very first statement that you made, or perhaps question that you're asking. You say, you completely agree with Jasmine's point that ignoring issues of race can inflict harm, which is absolutely true. But Jazz, and I would offer, I would give you I'd love to give you the chance to kind of respond here. If we don't want to put mentees in a place where they are responsible for teaching their mentors about race, then, how do we interpret or how do we balance that? It's not the responsibility of a young person to teach the mentor. So then, how do we approach a conversation? And I think it leads us into our action item, right?
No, yeah, that definitely makes sense. And I definitely believe leads into that action item. I would say though, you're completely right. It's not for the mentee to teach you. So that goes on to additional action items as well, as like, you have to be willing to do the work. So even, coming to webinars like this or reading literature, you have to be engaged to learning more on your own first. I really feel like before you can enter into these conversations, especially if it's a place and conversations that you're not really familiar with having with anyone, even people of the same race. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jazz, and thank you, Teddy. So with that, I think we can move on to our action item, which, as you recall now, we've talked about openness, understanding, and vulnerability, which are all 3 characteristics that we believe lead you to the action of validation. So when we begin to talk about race with young people, really nothing else can happen yet. Nothing can begin to be resolved unless we validate and honor, as you see on the screen here, stay in the moment and honor another person's experience. So, and specifically when we're saying another person, we're talking about a young person, a BIPOC young person. So Teddy, to answer your question, here, we don't want to, and I'm gonna make an assumption here. If I'm an adult, and I'm talking specifically, to a Black boy or girl, I'm an adult, I'm a Latino, and I'm talking to a Black boy or girl, or a young boy or girl of any different race from my own. The most important and fundamental action that I need to take in that moment is simply to validate, right? To take those three characteristics, use openness, vulnerability, and the third characteristic to validate the experiences that this young person is sharing with me. If I invalidate that young person's experience, the rest of the conversation is really going to be null. And it's not so much yet about, it's not about making, that young person, I'm not asking them to teach me something yet. As an adult, I may or may not be ready to learn, that's my responsibility. That's my homework. But validating a young person's experience is absolutely fundamentally necessary, in order to move a conversation forward. And I think, for many people on the line here, if you're a person of color, you have probably experienced invalidation of your racialized experiences, right? And that just like, just as we as adults, if our racialized experiences are invalidated, we kind of shut down, right? We may be unwilling to further the conversation. Similarly, these things can happen with a young person as well.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, so yeah, to that point, what Harrison was saying is, if we don't validate, then you're invalidating their everyday reality that our kids live in. And we need to let our young people know that we hear them and we see them, because as people of color, we often don't feel seen or heard in this world. So really not about taking action, but just when a young person comes to you and is able to be vulnerable, that you're open and understanding, and that you validate and listen to them. Even if you don't have to offer advice, but just being able to sit and listen to them really opens up the conversation and allows them to know that you are a safe person, that they can talk to you, and that you're not going to try to, change the subject or turn it into something that's not about race just because it's uncomfortable for you to sit with and for you to realize. And it might be an experience that you've never dealt with. Or I would say, next to that, if it's an experience close to invalidating, not to say, oh, well, I've had a similar experience, so then I really don't think it's about race. Because again, you don't have the lived experience of that child of color.
Right. Thank you. And Dakota, if we could see the last, the kind of the closing slide on this section. Thank you so much. So again, we just kind of want to visually represent what we are, sharing with you here. These three characteristics: openness, understanding, and vulnerability. Those three lead us to be able to validate. Simply begin by validating the racialized experiences of young people, which can then serve as a springboard, for further conversations. But it's our hope here, is to kind of be able to share the importance of these characteristics and this action in beginning conversations about race with young people. So with that, I want to hand it over or invite Sadiq back in, because I know that I have not been paying close attention to the chat, and I know that there's perhaps some takeaways and some questions that might be lingering there. So Sadiq.
Awesome, awesome. This is really, really good stuff. And man, I appreciate the engagement in the chat box as well. So I think we had one more hand raised by Sue, Sue Fox. I think you can unmute now, Sue.
Okay. Hi, I'm a mentor of a young 10-year-old African-American. She's 11 now. And I've only been with her about a month. And about the first month after we had first met, we were driving to an event and we passed some police officers that had stopped someone. And she just sort of blurted out, "I hate all policemen." And she said, "Do you like policemen?" And I said, I just wondered if I could have handled this better. I did, I guess now listening to these terms, I think I did a little bit of validation. I said, "I really understand how you must feel about some horrible things have been happening." This was about a year ago, before George Floyd. I said, and a lot we didn't even know because until there were cell phones. But then I added, was this bad to add, that I try not in my life to use the word all, because I find that usually all is not a word that applies. That there are some good police, there are good police and there are bad. And I don't know, should I have handled, and I didn't go into it. Should I have started a more, we were driving, like I said, to an event, and what other things could I have said, or could I have said it better? Or was that not validating by adding that last sentence?
So, wow, thank you, Sue, so much. Again, there's a lot wrapped in there, and I definitely have a thought, and I would love to hear from Harrison and Jasmine as well. I think for me, the first thing sort of goes back to some of Teddy's question, right? Because again, there was so much in there. We can like eat off that question for the rest of the time easily. For me, I'm always of the mind to go with the pace of the young person. So if a young person, if they blurt it out, accidentally, or if it was, a strategically placed blurt where they really want to know what you think without like coming out and asking you what you think, which is a common trick, right, that our young people kind of exercise. For me, I go at their pace. So for her to have brought that up means that she wants to talk about it. So I think the first piece, that's a good sign that she felt comfortable enough to share that with you. I do think along with that, as it pertains to openness, understanding, and vulnerability, again, these are such critical steps. So much of these steps are wrapped up in active listening, and that idea of, again, really seeking to understand, right? Like 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, then be understood. So even asking some probing questions, first and foremost, that validation. For true validation, my understanding is that we reserve all comment and thought and feedback for several moments, if not permanently, until that other person has an opportunity to fully express themselves. So potentially case in point might be, "Oh my goodness, thank you so much for sharing that. Like, man, basically tell me more," right? And sort of continue that conversation in that regard. Harrison, please.
Yeah, no, and I was going to say, Sadiq, I think a really valuable potential, kind of build up to the beyond the active listening, I think, is allowing the young person to offer even more of those thoughts, right? To signaling to them, like, I want to keep listening. I want to hear your frustration, and I want to hear your thoughts on how to fix it. Because think about how many young people aren't asked that question, right? They are prescribed things over and over again, right? This is how the world works. This is what you should do. This is what worked for me. So at the very outset, you know, just the active listening, the act of active listening is so important. And then also the follow-up of being able to say, and what do you think? How would this be better? It doesn't matter whether you agree with that or not. What you're doing is validating that young person's voice. And what that'll do is allow them to share more with you the next time, right? And that's the goal, right? The goal is open and really genuine two-way communication. And I think that, yes, that first step of active listening, you know, is only the first step. You know, I think we can, you know, take some follow-up steps to really get at, really listen for understanding, you know, from a young person.
Absolutely. And I would just say that, you know, the other side of that, Sue, which you somewhat alluded to, is that, was that appropriate? You know, was that an appropriate response? And I don't think it's about, you know, inappropriate, appropriate. It's just about better, right? Like, how can we give a better response? And I would just think to myself that in that moment, the idea of sharing your opinion, you know, in terms of all, right, or letting her know that in that moment, hey, you know, I don't really agree that all cops, or that you shouldn't hate all cops, is the potential implication in that moment of offering any of your opinion too prematurely, right? Instead of, again, just that validation. Thank you so much for sharing that. You know, what happened to make you feel that way? Or like, you know, how did you form that opinion? Just asking more of those probing questions, going deeper with them at their own pace. And then it might be weeks later until you offer your opinion, right? Or that might present an opportunity to, you know, so for some more mentor-mentee engagement activities. Maybe you set up a conversation with her for, you know, the most engaging officer that you know, and then you save it to the end that they're an officer, which I've seen happen in tons of different programs. Like, they'll bring a guy in, you know, he's tatted up, right? He's from the neighborhood, and he gives a whole presentation. A lot of young guys, they're sort of like into it, and at the end, it's like, oh yeah, by the way, I'm a cop. They're like, oh, you know, and that has happened over the course of. There's actually a police officer camp that I'm familiar with, so they'll actually do that. The big reveal is really over the course of like a couple weeks that they will spend together in the woods, camping, etc. And then as that relationship is you know, blossoming during that time, at the end is like the big reveal, and it really kind of hits home, like, oh my God, like there are some good cops out here. So just as an additional example.
All right.
Awesome. I'm just checking the chat box.
Yeah, we do have another hand raised for Agbegnagan again. So I'm gonna allow him to talk.
Go ahead.
Hello. Yeah. So trying to wrap up the opening understanding of vulnerability. What we have here at Experience is a couple years ago, we started building a team, you know, as they use it again, soccer. Soccer is a world sport who bring different people together. And then the program was most of it based on, Black kid. And then what we build our reputation, start winning. What happened? We still have a different, race start joining us, white, Spanish, Asian. And then down the road, what we realized, even if those people or those young guys, those race join us, and then we start building a team, when we get together, you don't see a mix. People, those kids team be hanging with people with their race, be in the corner, chatting, and then you'll see a bunch of crowds, but not just together, but be in the corner. And then, so we say, and then one of the kids came to me, say, Coach, we have a great representation, diversity group on this room, but what we're seeing, the conversation is now among everybody. We're just receiving people trying to be more comfortable with people of his color. And then the open spirit just comes and how can we resolve that problem to not just try to be a team, but be a team divided. So what we do, we make it open first. I have to call a meeting with the food, and then And I throw the question, say, hey, what can we do to mix, to more be friends for each other more than be talking about different stuff, even if we on now different school. And then once we have a 1 or 2, 3 times that kind of conversation, deeply, the dynamism just changes. And then everybody start understanding each other. And then what we see more results, and we see more team building, and then we see the vulnerability just go away. And then to finish, I can tell you, so we validate the circumstances to bring people of a different background together as a way the soccer wanting, team building, work together, fight together, smile together, having fun together, tease each other together. And then it is very strong and powerful. How can we make it open? We give a way for all those young guys, even if they are now on the same page and they are now different race, but they can bring a topic and talk about what can they take away to bring them together. Is a very powerful. That's what I want to share with you guys before we close it out. Thank you to give me a chance to talk about it.
Of course, of course. Thank you very much for sharing that, and thank you for the work that you, of course, are doing with a diverse group of young people. You know, I think this whole conversation that we've had today, we have to acknowledge that if we're talking to, you know, adults, generally speaking, mentors in this space, we have to acknowledge that there is a power, you know, dynamic here. And I'm thinking about a soccer team as you're describing it, right? If you have a group of young people who feel marginalized from a different group of young people, then the conversation that we're having today is the one with the dominant group, right? The openness, the understanding, the vulnerability, you know, has to come from that dominant group in relation to the group that's marginalized, right? So these principles, even though we've been talking to adults here, you know, mentors and practitioners and like all of us on, you know, panelists, this also applies on a soccer team, right? and if you have a group of marginalized young people and a group that's the dominant group, these are principles that can be applied there as well. So again, thank you for the work that you're doing, and I hope that you're able to take kind of some of these principles and apply them there as well.
And what I would say was what I heard you speak on was you maybe had the diversity on your team, but you didn't really have the inclusion. And so I think it's important to invite that youth voice in there and, you know, saying, this is what I see, and allow the youth to inform, you know, how can we change this and how can we invite that inclusion?
No, that's awesome. That's awesome. And I think the last point that jumped out for me is also that it takes time, that it takes time and intention. And I think, Jasmine, your point really brings that home, and that it's not enough to just dump a bunch of folks together, but it takes time, it takes work, and it takes intention in order to actually mix up that pot where we get the best flavor as a result, right? You can't just dump the seasoning in and just like hope for the best. You got to mix that thing up. You got to bake it. You might got to saute it, but if you just leave it in the skillet in one spot, it's going to burn. Exactly. And that's not what we want.
Exactly. Excellent.
Awesome.
So, yeah, go ahead, Sadiq.
No. I think we're going to move to the next slide and head towards conclusion. This has been an amazing conversation. You know, so ladies and gentlemen, if we could just sort of like just give Jasmine and Harrison a virtual round of applause here. Let's get some ones. That's my favorite. Just type a 1 in the chat box if you got something from this conversation today. If you guys could just give us a 1 in the chat box. We got some triple ones right there. We'll take all of those. Nice. We got some ones for y'all, Talbot Mentor team. Alan, you know, he's biased. He's from the Talbot Mentor team. Stop that, Alan. So just a couple of quick takeaways from everybody on the line with us. Once again, we really appreciate you all's presence and you all's openness to be able to join this conversation, which is, again, for us, the perfect segue into this beautiful quote by the writer, the famed writer and activist James Baldwin, who told us that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And, you know, I think this conversation is illustrative of that point, and that this is not going to just happen by itself. It's also not going to happen overnight. But the bottom line is that we have to make something happen if we are serious about change. And again, especially as it pertains to our young people, the stakes are high. The stakes are high. And every moment that we shy away from these conversations, every moment that we don't educate ourselves in preparation for these conversations, we are doing a disservice to them, and we're doing a disservice to ourselves. You know, I'm just reminded of a conversation that that I've had, you know, honestly, and in full transparency, a couple of times throughout the course of this year, and one with a really, really close white ally and friend of mine. And they made a remark one day, and you know, I immediately, you know, we just sort of launched into a deep conversation about it. And there's this idea that, you know, especially, you know, white people, right, the dominant culture in this country, there's this idea that, you know, undoing racism and, you know, eliminating white supremacy and really driving towards racial justice is for us as Black people or people of color, that somehow, you know, it's the benevolence of white people that is driving the undoing of racism and the elimination and the evisceration of white supremacy. And, you know, my friend, they said this to me, like, you know what, you know, we have to do this for you. And I corrected them on the spot in that it's not for me. It's actually for you. It's actually for you. So in the exact same way that we think this work about mentoring, we think it's for young people, but it's actually for us as adults. It's for us.
That's right.
Those folks that are in charge. It's our collective soul that hangs in a balance, not just white people doing it on behalf of Black and Indigenous people and people of color. It is for the souls of white folks as much as it is for souls of Black folks. And I just think that is a really, really important distinction, and one that we have to keep top of mind, and that we aren't doing anything for young people either. This is actually for us selfishly, and we need to proceed in that regard and educate ourselves along the way. So I just I'm really, really appreciative to the Talbot Mentors team. And there was one final point. I'll allow you to make that, Harrison, before we move into the next slide that has some additional resources. And I'll just ask you, Harrison, should we, right? Because we kind of opened up with that question, right?
Yeah.
Not only, like, you know, this was all about how, right, to have these conversations, but you alluded to this early on, Harrison.
Yeah.
Should we have these conversations about race with our young persons?
Yes, we absolutely need to. We cannot ignore the impact of racism on the young people that we serve. We cannot ignore it. What we ask of everyone on this line is to commit to educating yourself, commit to the work, commit to understanding our own advantages, biases, privileges, and actually to crystallize those privileges and leverage them to the benefit of young people who just don't have them just by luck of the draw, right? Because of where they were born or whatever other, you know, qualifier we want to use. We have to recognize that these young people, many young people have systemic, structural, significant barriers, you know, to their success. It means nothing about their capacity. It says nothing about their willingness to succeed. It's just, we have to recognize that the world around them is the one that impacts their ability to succeed. That's why we're all in this work, but we have to call it what it is when it comes to structural and systemic racism. So, you know, being on a webinar like tonight and having and dialoguing with us is a part of the process. So we're really grateful for everyone on the line, and we just ask you to commit to lean in to this uncomfortable work, because you will certainly leave a legacy long after you and I are all gone.
You know, Harrison, just one other point I'll make really quickly, and this is again back to the final point in Teddy's question a little while ago, is when do these conversations help and when are they harmful? And I think this last point that Harrison is making is so critical, in that there is a right way and a wrong way to do this. And the right way is the way that is scatter shot, shoot from the hip, hope for the best as our primary strategy.
Right.
As opposed to the right way, the helpful way is one that I am preparing for this conversation. It's never going to be perfect.
Right.
We don't let perfect be the enemy of progress.
Right.
But I got to do some sort of preparation beforehand. Can't just go in all willy-nilly. Right. And hope it's going to turn out well, because it is not going to.
Yeah, right, exactly. So yeah, that's why, I think these are great first steps, and we ask you to lean into your organizations, your state affiliates, like Maryland Mentor, for guidance, advice, connections to folks who are doing this work. We at Talbot Mentors, we're very proud to stand on certain principles, of anti-racism. We believe those two things can't exist separately, because of the children that we serve. So yeah, this is a process. This is life's work, for all of us. We hope. Yeah, to Sadiq's point, there is a right approach to it, and we hope you've taken away a little bit today, at least. We hope we've been a little bit helpful.
Jasmine, final word before we wrap up, and we're gonna run through this next slide. We're gonna pass it back to Dakota. Don't leave yet. If you're on this webinar, don't leave yet. We need an evaluation completed. Let's go ahead and start dropping that link into the chat box too. But I wanted to give Jasmine the final word too. Thank you so much, Jasmine.
Oh, I'm good.
Awesome. Dakota, back to you. Thank you, everybody.
Yes, so the evaluation that we're talking about, actually, if you have your phone on you right now, you can bring it out and go onto your camera and scan this QR code, and it will take you directly to that survey. And also, we will drop a link in the chat box for you to do as well. Let me just get that real quick. We'll give you guys like a minute or two.
And yes, Cynthia, these slides will be sent out. So yeah, I know we just breezed through that additional resources slide, but there are a ton which we actually took from the attendee guide, the participant guide from our Combating White Saviorism in mentoring programs from, again, just a couple of weeks ago. So we will be sure to send that out. No worries. And excellent. I have the link here too. I just found it.
Yeah.
If you guys want to click the link in the chat box, don't even worry about it. We got it.
Excellent. Also move on here too. And also we do have some upcoming trainings similar to this one on different topics that are open to the public and free. Here's our last two for this fall quarter. If you're interested, and again, all this information is on our website, which is marylandmentor.net. Yeah, thank you all very much for being here. Thank you for our trainers for facilitating this and sharing with us. You guys did an amazing job. Yes, give them a round of applause. Please. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good night, everybody.
All right, everybody. Be well.
All right. Thanks, Sadiq. Thank you, Dakota.
Thank you.